Thank you very much for having us. So we're going to share the time. We have common interests, also differences that you will see. I will just talk for a bit, and Lotte will follow. So I like when I speak also with people who care for nature. I like to start with this example that you see on the slide, and it's a fish. It's actually an eel, an electric fish, that was collected in Suriname in the 18th century. And it's a fish I worked with or about in a recent project, because it's interesting also from the conservation perspective. So in order to work with this fish as an art historian, I have to discuss with my natural history colleagues. And when we visited the fish, we wanted to explore it, to know more about it. So the person in charge, the curator, just decided to just unpack the bottle and show it to us and say, wow, it's a very big fish. It's a very old fish. It's so fascinating. And we were very like, oh, but no, you don't, please don't touch it. This is a historical artifact. It has to remain like that. Because for us, it has a long histories and multiple layers. As I said, it was collected in the 18th century, preserved in alcohol, and then sent to Europe, sent to Geneva, the city where I'm based part of the time. And we wanted to explore the connection between Geneva and other countries, other continents. And one of these connections was this fish. And the more we explored, the more we discovered about who the collectors were. So we have this mention of Butini collection, and it's very much connected to this Butini guy who's an 18th century planter from Geneva who lives in Suriname at the time. But he didn't collect the fish himself. It's an electric fish, it's a dangerous fish. So he had his enslaved people collecting it for him. And the more we also traces back the provenance of the fish, the collection history, then we discovered that the liquid, I mean, the alcohol in which the fish was preserved was rum, like the alcohol you can drink, but also the alcohol that the enslaved people produced at the time on the plantation. So the way it was conserved in rum. Now, of course, the alcohol has been changed multiple times because, as you know, it evaporates over time. But the fish itself, its history, its provenance, his collecting, but also its preservation became for us a starting point for telling different stories about the role of enslaved people in natural history, about the politics of conservation, because it was very political, the way it was preserved, the way it was displayed, the proper alcohol in which it was preserved. All of that was political. And that's a bit how I relate to that topic of politics of conservation. It's to say it's political until the very last layer somehow, including the products, including the formats, including the way the fish is now displayed. And it's still like that. It's still very tiny, very packed, because it was not made for display or for being super shiny. It was really like made for lasting and made for being studied. So that's something for me that I'm interested in, and that's also how I connect to longer time period, going back to the 18th century in that case, but also sometimes to the 17th and 16th century, because the wish to preserve things or nature is not new. We call it conservation. It had other name before, but this is not a new thing. It has changed. The products have changed, the people have changed, the theories have changed, but the preservation interest is very long lasting, and that's also what I try to show in my research. So I wanted to connect nature conservation and objects conservation, because I've been lucky enough to follow a bit of the talks on the series, and I found it's very clearly not comparable, but there are strong similarities. One very obvious, it's the terminology. It's the same words, conservation, basically, but also reserve for animals. But in my case, it's storages. So it's really exactly the same words. The other similarities I would like to highlight is that conservation, and I think since the 16th century until today, it's producing a specific images or specific objects or a version of these images. It's not only preserving, it's producing, it's fixing a version of things. And then I guess I found it in two different as well in the nature area as in the museum area, if you want. And the third common point, I think it's prescribing relations between humans and non-humans. Conservation is a way, or I see it as a way, and I saw it also during the talks I was lucky enough to listen, to organize who's going to have access to what, who can touch whom, who's going to access or enter a territory or not. And I know it's not badly intentioned, but in many cases, as we have seen, it's problematic and it's political. So that's a very brief intro, and I will just develop in a couple of examples and give the word to Lotte. First point, the vocabulary. I will just quote somebody I've heard in that story 2 weeks ago, and he says, it's Frank Matosa, and he said, reserves as epicenters of violent conservation should be reconsidered for being the main and miserable goal of conservation. And when I saw that, I really was struck, surprised, but also somehow pleased or interested by this comparison, because I think in the museum way, you can also see reserve as epicenters of violent conservation. It is related to what we call preventative conservation. So you don't touch the objects, but you create the condition of their preservation. And that's what reserve are about. And as you probably know, in a museum, like in an art museum, it's only like 2-3% of a museum collection that you will see in the galleries, and all the rest is in these reserves. And they are also, I guess, I'm afraid, epicenters of violent conservation. And I really don't mind it in a bad way or in an accusing way for my colleagues conservators, because I know they also do, and storage manager, they also do what they can in a specific framework. But it still raises questions. Just give one example. It's this practice of anoxia. Maybe you are familiar with it because it does actually happen in different contexts. Also, this really concern art museum, ethnographic museum, nature museum. But in the case of the Quai Branly, this is where photographs are coming from. Objects, or if we want to call them objects, things, or treasures, are put in this anoxia room in order to be disinfected. So they are put in that rooms, they're isolated, the oxygen gas is taken away, another gas is injected for a long time, it can be weeks, and it has the good advantage to kill the insects. So the objects are clean, if you want, when they go out of that. There has been a lot of discussion by Native people, by Native American people, also by different communities, that actually this anoxia system, this deprivation of oxygen, was political and was potentially dangerous, and not so much dangerous because you cannot breathe, but because the objects could not breathe, and they expected the object to breathe, because for them it's not objects, as I said, it's ancestors. So a practice that is preventative conservation, that is supposed to kill insect, and it does kill insect, it works well, actually it's good in a way, has also its political counterpart and can be seen and criticized as violent conservation. The second point, producing images and object fixing up, in our case, sometimes Western version of material culture and nature. A topic that came back in the talks I've heard in that series too, the last weeks, was how, for instance, the wish to preserve elephant or a specific nature that was somehow often connected to the safari imagination or the tourism, was not only conserving just like what was there, but definitely producing or connected to a vision of what should be there, what Africa would be actually like. And in the history of conservation, you've got since a long time, a similar phenomena. I just give one example, two actually example, and it doesn't happen anymore. We don't do that anymore. This is clear to me, but that's 18th century way to preserve antique fragments. And you don't just preserve the fragments, you reconstruct it. It's what we call restoration. It's not what we call conservation. But in order to preserve it, you construct something around it that gives it a meaning. And you don't necessarily touch the fragment itself, but you expand it. And in the way to preserve and to present it, then you change it and you give it a meaning that might or might not be the original meaning, that sometimes doesn't matter. But you create something else through conservation. And that I find also in nature conservation since a very long time. Another example given to me by my colleague Yael Biro, it's how African objects were polished, they were clean, of course they were detached from their original context, they were like covered with patina. They were really made like those primitive, beautiful artworks we know and we like, or I do know and like. But this is that was made in Europe, and that was made through conservation. So on the way, it's about preserving, giving access, giving visibility, giving a price, but it's also having in mind an image and constructing the object with the patina. It should be glossy, it should be a person, it should be beautiful, it should be clean, and so on and so forth. And this is not the reality. This is a constructed reality. And third point, prescribing relation between humans and non-humans. And I think that's something also we really have in common between arts and nature conservation. And unfortunately, since a long time. So if we just go back to the beginning and this reserve like storage rooms, you see that mask, it's alone, it's in the dark, it's in the cold, there is like a fence, it's really not accessible. And visually, it's also when you enter that kind of storages, you're like, wow, okay, wow. And there are people who are also conservators, of course, who are aware of that. And there are artists who are trying to challenge that limits and who can access, who can reclaim ownership, just contact, who can reclaim contact, and what kind of contact. And she's an artist. We worked with Lotte and myself, Rosanna Raymond, and she performed touching her treasures or the treasures of her communities and reclaiming a direct contact to that material culture or immaterial culture. Trying to challenge what conservation is and trying to say, okay, conservation has evolved. We describe restoration, preventative conservation, and so on and so forth. It has a history, but today, for the present and for the future, we need to rethink what it is, because for her, it's not conservation if it's isolated in a storage room. So I just finished with the three goals I have for myself with this European research grant. I hope I will achieve these goals. Who knows? But that's to think about the terminologies and spaces of conservation. And one of the solutions I have put in place is to create an online dictionary with multiple definition and evolving definition, and different people writing different definition of what, for instance, breathing is or light could be. The other thing I would like to do is to dismantle the narratives of Western supremacy and conservation, because I don't want to enter that, but it happens a lot in the restitution debate that the argument is, oh, we cannot give it back because they don't know how to preserve or they don't know how to conserve. We need to keep it because we know better. But of course, this is a narrative, and there are other tradition, other conception actually of what conservation is and could be. And the third point is and because I'm an art historian, I'm not a conservator, so I also have to somehow bring some content from my field. I'm exploring now with colleagues from different continents, what are the practices, what are the histories, what are the theories of conservation in a broad sense. And that is not only the European sense. That is one perspective on conservation, but definitely not the only one. So that's for my part. And I will give, and we can talk about it later or not. I will stop sharing my screen and give space to Lotte for more about her research.
Thank you, Noémie. Lotte, the floor is yours. You are still muted.
Yeah. Now it's better. Now you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
That's fantastic. Noémie, thank you so much for this shared introduction. Tahani, for your invitation. Katerina, for the kind introduction. It's fantastic to be here. I'm also very happy that we can be in conversation around conservation practices between fields. So there's one central aspect in the restitution debate that is still very little discussed, that is the historic parallel in the constitution of natural history museums and ethnological museums. And so the very big shared epistemological, but also, historical parts that these institutions have in common. And so far, many of the discussions that we have in the one part are absolutely disconnected from what is happening also broadly in the natural history museums. And so maybe occasions like this can be a moment to sync things together. Just as Noémie, well, it's from a different personal history. I'm not coming from the field of conservation neither, but from the one of cultural history. And I became interested in questions of conservation in the frame of the restitution discussion. So of a moment where actually after decades where museums in the West defended their collections as universal collections, there was a starting reflection on different approaches to conservation, to practices, to the questions of authority that could actually happen around these collections. And so museums in different manners and with shy steps started to begin some self-reflexive practices. And I show you here an image from the Grassi Museum in Dresden that in 2020 was under the directorship of Nanette Snoop and showed an exhibition that actually was meant to show the coulisses, so behind the scenes, to show how the museum actually works in order to produce the situations that are on display. And we have here a presentation of conservation devices that still, if you look a little bit into the realities today, seem without intention, unintentionally quite romantic. So you have gloves and cotton, you have an inventory card where you can write with a pencil. So it is an approach that evokes in most of us the idea of a conservator that is far from the reality of many institutions, where conservation work goes along with devices like these nitrile gloves that you see here in several of the institutions. Oh, maybe here's La Cité de la Musique in Paris that I thought is an interesting institution to look at also in the frame of this colloquium, because these are musical instruments. And so the question of how to keep actually objects that have been meant to be practiced, to play, to generate a sound, raises a question of what is this object actually about when it is reduced to its materiality, which in a certain manner, and so to the stability of the materiality, which in a certain manner is one of the connection points where we come back. So the degrees of the vestiges of chemical conservation are quite different from one place to another. In Berlin, in Leipzig, or here in Brussels, they lead to quite drastic situations when approaching the objects in the storages. And this, I think, is a condition that many natural history museums share because of the very toxic materials that have been employed in the conservation of organic materials, like reaching from arsenic over lindan to DDT. Here are some pictures from visit in the frame of a research that I'm conducting right now together with the artist Sybille Couvy-Andé-Magnan, preparing for an exhibition next year at the Natural History Museum in Toulouse. And so we followed the everyday practice of the taxonomist and of the ethnological museum storage manager. One of the images that I wanted to share with you was the fact that Toulouse actually brings the question of touch into the exhibition part of the presentation. So contrary to other museums where the effects of toxic conservation are actually silenced and are not becoming an object of reflection, in Toulouse you have these different explanations that actually hint or show the fact that in spite of this generation of the idea of living animals standing in this library, you are not meant to approach it because there are dangerous residues. I think it is important that the conservation practices from Western museums do not stop at the borders of Europe, but have in the frame of colonial politics been exported to the museums that are still in practice. And so contrary to many museums in Europe and in the US or Northern America that start to reflect on the vestiges of toxic conservation and the needs to respond to these hazardous remains. Many of the conservators, but also the visitors in the museums here in Dakar, are still today confronted to very high presence of chemical products and no means of protection. As many of you working in museums will know, in the past 2.5 decades, there has been a rising awareness of the vestiges of chemical conservation, leading to approaches that at the one hand describes and develop new practices around contaminated cultural materials, introduces into the working days or into the practical work different steps of protection for people who would actually be in touch with these collections. I would like to jump back a little bit in history and cross the question of the start of chemical conservation methods in museums with the one of colonial collecting. And I brought here an image from the 1930s. The image is potentially staged. It is quite contested, and it is possible that the directors of the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro in the 1930s actually arranged it because they tried to get more money in order to restructure the museum, and the ambition was to restructure it in a manner that they explained as a scientific approach to the museum and as a scientific approach to conservation. And I think it is important to bear in mind that it is at the very moment where the inflow of objects through colonial collecting, so between the Berlin Conference in 1884-85 and the 1960s for France, with 1930 as this big last states collecting mission, Dakar Djibouti. There are actually tens of thousands of objects that are coming into the museum, and the museum at the same time is developing this method that has this ambition of scientificity. And it is in this frame that the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro introduces a toxic oven, which is an object that has afterwards been exported to Dakar, to Vietnam. We just came back from Geneva yesterday and found proof that Geneva, as late as 1987, bought a toxic oven, so a toxic chamber that was in use for not very long, but still very costly for the museum. So there was this belief that actually there was a possibility to keep things, to render the lifespan of things eternal through the fact to subtract life. And I think this contradiction, this tension between this idea of eternity, the possibility to inscribe objects in this longue durée of the nation state, of the fact to patrimonialize, to make out of an animal or out of a cultural element that has existed in networks of beings and practices, an object, that this is closely tied to this moment of the ambition to scientifically prolong the existence of a collection. I wanted to quote Tiziana Beltram, who speaks about the temporality of collections and about the double erasure linked to the materiality of artifacts, that of the historical dimension of a context in which certain objects had the right to be transformed, even to perish, and that of the temporal dimension of the institution within which objects must be stabilized at all cost. And as I know that some of you are in Berlin, I just jump for a second into Asaf Gruber's film, The Conspicuous Parts, where you have one of the characters getting into the Alpine diorama and actually needing for this tour de campagne heavy equipment in order not to suffocate. Yes, alors we spoke about that. I think that the time is relatively short, and so I won't go into much detail. I saw it in the German context about one of the few museums that actually brought the question of the toxicity of collections quite early in the discussion about potential practices. And this was a Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt under the directorship of Clémentine Dillis, who between 2010 and 2015 practiced a lot with artist residencies in the collection, and was running into different obstacles that toxicity was actually one of these. So I wanted to bring in the discussion this double-sidedness of a debate that at the one hand allows to understand how conservation practices in museums in Europa and Northern America have produced a reality that will exist beyond the moment of the museum itself. So if we think about restitution, that does not mean that the question of toxicity can be annihilated, just disappears by this. But the other way around, and this is something that many of us are experiencing right now, toxicity also becomes an argument at the very moment where museums start to discuss about the fact to open their collections, becomes an argument to close them again because of the uncertainty of dangers of hazardous materials that people could be exposed to. And I think we could maybe discuss this double-sided moment at some time today. I will, at some time today, because it is exactly, and here an image from another artist, Matthias de Groef, who actually traced back this moment where the Africa Museum in Brussels, after nearly 100 years without touching their dioramas, opened this time capsule. And at the moment of opening this time capsule, there come retarding elements like toxicity in order to, or that lead to the fact that practices of taking out of showcases, of reinscribing things, objects, cultural practices in the present are actually still problematic. And a last image by artist Kabwani Kiwanga, who spoke about this relationship, calling it a double absence. So an absence at the one hand because the access to objects in collections is going through obstacles, and then toxicity comes as another level of erasure in order to, or that leads to a situation where interactive practices with objects is no longer possible. I thought initially that I would speak a little bit about the National Museum of Lubumbashi, but I think I will do this in another occasion and stop here, and then we have time for discussion. Thank you very much.